Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, our co-host. Daniel, good to see you.
How are you this morning, Dr. Paul?
Doing fine.
Good.
Yesterday we talked about Trump's move in Syria and complimented him on it. A lot of compliments since then. Yesterday we sort of thought at the time that maybe it looked like they were going to have that budget argument and the wall argument over with, but it's still there.
Simmering.
They don't even know when they're going home. And one thing is I think there's 100 members of Congress that are leaving. If you remember, on my last month there, you don't have an office or anything, and they don't even know how they can round up people. So that is a technical mess outside of trying to find money for a wall that we don't need. But I want to follow up with our program yesterday, which is a follow-up in the media and around the world, much more so. Many more people have spoken about Trump saying, look, we've had enough. I've said it in the campaign. This world war is not a good war. We need to defeat ISIS and come home.
Yeah.
And as far as he's concerned, ISIS has been defeated, and he set out the order to come home. But what is interesting is the different reactions. The one reaction we expected, the neocons would go nuts.
Yeah.
And, the Tom Cottons and the Grahams, they all went nuts over the whole thing. But then there's the part that I like the best of this are a couple lefties who must have a sense of principle left in them. And that is, there was one, Ted Lieu, a controversial leftist, but on this issue, he was very good because he hates Trump. He says this is the right thing to do. I like that when people sort of are in a conflict and they pick principle. And Chris Matthews was the same way. Yeah. He said Trump's right on this thing, and he was chastising the others, which included some even on his own station, because they were arguing, well, we got to go after Trump, and now there's a division in the Republican Party. Let's keep that division going, and they were stirring it up. So there's a lot going on here, and a lot of people. I mean, the Turks are involved, the Kurds are involved, the military-industrial complex is involved, and in a way, why should it be complicated? We were in a place we shouldn't have been in. It's a war that's unconstitutional, doesn't make any sense. We don't know why we're there. We don't know when we're supposed to come home. And finally, we have a president, in this case, doing exactly what he said he wants to do, and they go nuts. So I guess we shouldn't be shocked. I'm shocked that there would be these factions. But in a way, it's disappointing. But that's the one thing that I sort of like. There's a few there. And, of course, that's a coalition that I've always been interested in, is, a principled a liberal or a progressive who's anti-war and pro-civil liberties. Why can't they talk to us? And in this case, a few of them did.
Yeah, and I think, this is, Washington showing its colors. Here are the neocons, the main proponents of the unitary executive. He's the decider. He's the commander-in-chief. Then when he finally acts as a decider, acts as a commander-in-chief in a constitutional way, removing troops from somewhere they shouldn't go, all of a sudden, he didn't tell us. He didn't ask us. He's not listening to us. What's going on here? And I think actually we have a series of tweets that we're going to throw out there and talk about a little bit, because I think it shows how Washington is thinking about this. The first one is from Justin Amash, who I know that is a former colleague and certainly a libertarian-leaning and very, very critical of President Trump, has been this entire time. But he makes a good point. Justin Amash, representative from Michigan, Republican from Michigan, said, "You're right on Syria, President Trump. The same senators complaining that they weren't given advance notice were perfectly content when President Obama introduced U.S. forces into Syria without advance approval from Congress, as the Constitution requires. Their concern is backward."
Right. And when we wrote up some resolutions trying to get us out of war and those things, we were always careful not to overstep the congressional bounds of usurping power away from the president. We didn't want a very powerful president, so to speak. But in the military, he is the commander-in-chief, and if the troops are out there, he is the commander, so we don't want to affect that. In this case, they finally say, oh, he shouldn't be doing it. This is the one place where the commander-in-chief, what he can do. I mean, the Congress forced this, another president put him in. The war is a dumb war, and it's unconstitutional, and then they criticize him for doing it. This is one place where a president that has even a memory of the Constitution did the right thing.
Yeah, exactly. And I think we have the second tweet, if we're just going to go through a couple of these, because I think it's interesting. Here's the president himself, because he's looking at the firestorm over what he said. He's tweeting at 3 in the morning. He should be sleeping, but he said, getting out of Syria was no surprise. I've been campaigning on it for years. And 6 months ago, when I very publicly wanted to do it, I agreed to stay longer. Russia, Iran, Syria, and others are the local enemy of ISIS. We were doing their work. Time to come home and rebuild.
Boy, I'll tell you, that's a great statement. But, the whole idea, the neocons are saying, we have to stay. We don't want to be like, I guess it was Bush, when they took troops out too soon in Iraq, and then we set the stage for, the radicals to come in. But this whole thing is, they want to stay to fight terrorism. And I do believe that in spite of all the ineptness, there's less ISIS there now, and that is not a threat. But what they don't understand, what they don't even want to consider, is why is there such an incentive for ISIS to exist in the first place? And why is there a threat of terrorism? Why is there blowback? It has to do with our occupation. Yeah. So here we are, a bunch of guys that are fulfilling their promises to the military-industrial complex. Stay there, we got to go after them, because if we don't, there won't be any ISIS left. How are we going to justify our military and our existence and our military expenditures? So this is the whole thing. They either don't know or don't want to know, and maybe both. I don't think the average American right now is really thinking that if we don't stay in there and fight that war to completion, that for some reason we are going to be in deeper danger and deeper threat militarily by some country. There has to be a couple thinking, oh no, we have to do it because they're coming to get us. And they did convince a lot of people like that of the danger of Saddam Hussein, which was all a lie. And I just don't think the American people are buying into the lies like to. Wouldn't it be neat to see a real, honest-to-goodness polling of the American people on whether this was a good idea or not? And there's a lot of polling by politicians. They go with the flow, but they also go with the special interests. So when the general opinion is against what they believe in, they don't have a real opinion. But I would be willing to put a little money on the line that the American people, on average, if they know the facts, think there's no sense of us being in Syria.
I can't imagine this any different. But, this is the central fallacy that the neocons have pushed for years, that somehow terrorism and unrest rose up in Iraq because we left. That's a central fallacy. Whereas in reality, the rest of us living in the reality-based community, those things arose in Iraq because of the intervention, not because of us leaving. We went in, destroyed the society based on a lie, destroyed the infrastructure, destroyed the military, and all of a sudden, in a reaction, terrorists rose up, anti-Americans rose up, and it's all of a sudden because we left. No, it's because we went in the first place.
And back after 9/11, it was easier to perpetuate a lie. I think it's more difficult now because reality is setting in. But back then, remember the lie and the tying in that Saddam Hussein harbored the terrorists, and that was all based on a lie. They had the names mixed up, and yet the American people, there's still some people, don't you remember that when Saddam Hussein he was harboring the terrorists that hit us on 9/11? Oh, don't you remember? I think Saudi Arabia was involved a little bit in that deal.
That's about a lie. A lie will go around the world several times before the truth comes out. But the other fallacy that's involved in the complaint now, that, hey, if we leave now, ISIS is going to be victorious. Well, there's something wrong with that, because the Syrian government has been fighting ISIS for 6 years, 5 years, 7 years, however you want to slice it. That's their real enemy. It's in their backyard. It threatens a multi-sectarian, multicultural society in Syria with a jihadist dictatorship. Of course, that's their enemy. Somehow, if we leave, The Syrian government's going to say, oh, come on in, ISIS. The Russians are going to say, oh, we spent all those millions of dollars. Come on back, no problem. The Iranians, who are mortal enemies of ISIS, are going to say, come on back, come on in. It's absurd.
You could have somebody do a study. I think it was in 2011 when Obama made the first statement, Assad has to go. From that moment, I mean, we put our, even though we didn't have the troops there, well, we probably had the CIA there yet too. But I think if you added up how things got much worse from the time we declared our interest and our participation in making sure that Assad had to go, and it really had nothing to do with ISIS. If anything, the hypocrisy that is hardly ever mentioned is that ISIS was a tool of our foreign policy. Yeah, we used it to build it up, but if there were some terrorists and radicals or radical faction, there were many factions, if they were willing to do our bidding to try to help us get rid of Assad, they were there. And that, of course, is a little bit more than, the politicians can handle right now. But that was the truth of the matter, that they were doing that. This whole idea that we have to go in there before ISIS reorganizes,
That's crocodile tears from people like Rubio and Graham and the late McCain, because these people are responsible for the expansion of ISIS and al-Qaeda in Syria. They're the ones that pushed Obama to arm these groups. Oh, no, they're moderates. Don't worry, they're moderates. Turns out they're all al-Qaeda. They're all ISIS. We armed them. We trained them. We set them up because we wanted to overthrow Assad. So these people who are now screaming about how ISIS is going to get powerful are the ones who made them powerful in the first place.
Some of the quotes that we have used, they're very pragmatic and utilitarian because it doesn't make any sense. Why are we there? And that's essentially what we've talked about so far. But the prevention of these kind of problems is found in having people of integrity to represent us in Washington that actually have read the Constitution, take it to heart, and they follow it, which means the American people should put pressure on their members of Congress not to send any troops overseas to fight a war that has not been declared through the Congress by the people. And that's so difficult to understand, and people ignore it, and that should be a big issue too. That yes, we're here because we have a bunch of people in Washington, that we only have a dozen or so that actually understand this and would like to see it that way. But I think they're getting more attention now, and especially when we saw that vote in the Senate, the other day about stopping the war in Yemen. I mean, it can shift, attitudes can shift, and unfortunately, it took a long time for the attitude to shift against the war in Vietnam. But it will happen, but it takes a lot of energy getting the people's attention.
Yeah, but you got to start somewhere. We have a couple more tweets. This next one I just put up there for fun because I think it's kind of interesting. It talks about what can happen when the Senate works with the president on an issue. This is President Trump tweeting out, again at 3:30 in the morning, he should be sleeping, but he said, quote, he's quoting Senator Paul and Senator Lee. "I'm proud of President today to hear that he's declaring victory in Syria," Senator Rand Paul. Here's another quote. "I couldn't agree more with the president's decision. By definition, this is the opposite of an Obama decision," Senator Mike Lee. So he knows that a couple of people up on the Hill have got his back on this.
Sounds to me like they're our friends that you just quoted.
Sounds like they're pretty good. And we have a couple more because we started out talking about Ted Lieu. And Ted Lieu is, if you follow him on Twitter, he's a pretty vicious guy. He wants Trump out. He's all for the Mueller investigation. He is anti-Trump as it comes. But we talk about people that recognize principle above politics. And I think Ted Lieu, as much as I hesitate to praise him, he deserves it. And let's put up a couple of his tweets. This is a good one. He's calling out his fellow liberals. "For any liberals who now suddenly agree with the war hawks about using force in Syria, here are some questions. What's the desired end state in Syria? Who are we supporting? How does a small force of 2,000 U.S. troops get us to the end state? How much endless war is enough?" It's a good one. And let's just go to the final one. This is also Ted Lieu, Representative Democrat from California. He's also taking out the liberals now. "Note to liberals who now support military force in Syria because of the Kurds or Russia or Iran or Turkey or humanitarian reasons. None of those war actions were authorized by Congress. Only authorized use of force was to go after terrorists. President is right to withdraw troops."
It's powerful.
Yeah.
isn't it a little bit sad you have a person like this that understands this issue so clearly, and I happen to believe, and I'm confident that we're taking that same principle and then applying to other areas of politics, whether it's in economic policy or civil liberties.
Yeah.
And some of those who might take that position would be pretty good on civil liberties, but all of a sudden, they won't apply it to economic policy of a voluntary approach, even if pragmatically and utilitarian-wise, it is a better way to do it. They all of a sudden say, well, we need an authoritarian government in economic policy and welfareism and all this, even though it serves a special interest too. So that is always my goal, is try to take those principles that we just talked about, and those who stick to it in one area, hey, why don't you just try them in another area? And on occasion over the years, I have found that if you talk to a liberal that's willing to listen and apply this, over time, they may make their other positions a little more mellow, and come along. But unfortunately, the successes are rare.
One step at a time. We'll take what we can get. But, we looked at the bright side now with Senator Lieu, and now, unfortunately, Dr. Paul, we have to go to the dark side.
Oh.
And the neocons, as you know, were flipping out in Washington yesterday, today. Lindsey Graham is tweeting his fingers bloody. But they got together and they sent a letter. Graham, Rubio, Cotton, and a few others, all the neocons, they sent a letter just furious with the president for what he's doing. But they kind of tipped their hand with what they're really interested in. And I had a couple of quotes from this letter. The first of all, quote, "The withdrawal of American presence in Syria also bolsters two other adversaries to the U.S., Iran and Russia." Oh, okay, so it's not about terrorism. They also say both Iran and Russia have used the Syrian conflict as a stage to magnify their influence in the region. That is interesting, and that's worth thinking about. He's accusing Iran and Russia of taking advantage of the situation in Syria to bolster their image, to bolster their influence in the region. Well, why is that?
Well,
Think about the U.S. getting involved in the first place, destabilizing it, opening the door, just like in Iraq when we opened the door for Iran to get involved, but fix the problems we made.
There's a lot of noise here, a lot of different issues, and they all play a part in it. But I think the big issue is Iran.
Yeah.
I really do. I think it's this, a lot of senators and even in Trump's own administration, which he had a right to keep it a little quiet because who knows what would happen. And a lot of them were informed. I don't see a big problem with that. But especially when you're moving away from war, if you start a war in secret, that's a little bit different. But, there were some that were notified. Not too many, but for some reason, it's interesting to know that Netanyahu was told about it.
Was he? Yeah.
He was told about it. And he said, "Well, this is good," or something like that. It was very, very bland. I hope it would work. He didn't say anything provocative, but that's still part of this coalition that Trump has there. As good as this is, he also set his standards at the beginning of his term, when he said the two most important places to visit in my first couple months would be Saudi Arabia and Israel.
Yeah.
And they're important, but that puts them up on a high plane. And but I think the battle between Sunnis and Shia, Saudi Arabia and Iran is a big deal. And then the other stuff, whether they're Kurds and the Turks or Israel or these other places in the United States, we all get involved and we get talked into. And then oil is a temptation too. You mean we can help Saudi Arabia and then get cheap oil. So, but right now the oil is so cheap that there's been predictions that if they're not careful, they may go bankrupt. That would be an interesting political function.
Yeah, our good friend Talib had a good point about that. I would just end by warning everyone, Dr. Paul and I are smiling a lot today. We're not Pollyannas. We don't believe that a miracle will happen and we'll pull out. We realize and we understand there are a lot of complications. The president sometimes says nice things and doesn't follow through. So we are still cautious, but we're cautiously optimistic. We want to give praise where it's warranted. The other final thing I would say, we had a great show yesterday in terms of viewership. A lot of people came out and watched the show. They were interested in Dr. Paul's opinion and analysis of what was happening in breaking news. That is the whole idea of the Liberty Report. When something breaks, to be able to come out, give the perspective, the pro-freedom, the pro-peace, the pro-liberty perspective on these issues, and You, our audience, are responding, and we're grateful and thankful. We also have to remind you again that this is the end of the year. This is where we're able to raise the money to keep the show going, to keep the Ron Paul Institute, the conferences, bringing people together, bringing back this peace movement, this peace coalition beyond left and right. And to do that, we do need your tax-deductible support. You can get tax credit for 2018 for donations you make before midnight. ronpaulinstitute.org/support will include a link, but we really want you to be a part of the show and help us continue to grow the show, and we're deeply appreciative.
Very good. And I too want to thank our viewers for tuning in and supporting us. I think the most interesting thing about what's going on right now is what I've already talked about, and it gives us an opportunity to take some who may disagree with us on other issue, but on principle, stand on principle, like I mentioned, and be pro-Trump on this issue, even though they really despise Trump, because the issue itself was most important. So I think that is important. I've always looked for openings over the years and try to compliment people when they do this. And believe it or not, it has paid off at times. I've been very pleased with some of the acquaintances I've made by merely giving a person a compliment, which way they probably thought, well, I don't even agree with him. But we do agree frequently when you run into somebody that may call themselves a liberal or a progressive, and we do agree. But they shouldn't be surprised. So I'm going to continue to work on that effort for a coalition, because believe me, we're not going to be able to snap our fingers and get everybody to agree with the entire philosophy. But if you can get coalitions together, success could be made. To me, it's so logical to take some of these principles and apply it to a voluntaristic approach in economics. But that, again, is another big issue. But once again, I want to thank you for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.